Good morning and welcome to this morning scoop from the Arizona Capital Times. I'm Steve Goldstein. Thank you very much for taking the time to be with us this morning for this extremely important discussion titled Arizona Students Still Missing Too Much School, as our focus will be on chronic absenteeism. As the hour proceeds, we'll be looking for those of you who are watching live to send in questions to our panelists, and we'll get to as many of those as we can. But before we get to a broader conversation, it's my pleasure to introduce Paul J. Luna, President and CEO of Helios Education Foundation. Paul, please take it away.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you for that introduction and appreciate you hosting this morning's webinar. Also want to make sure that I thank Gary Grotto and the Arizona Capital Times for the opportunity to co-host this really important conversation around chronic absenteeism. And for all of you that have joined us this morning, please know how much all of us appreciate you taking the time out of, I'm sure, your very busy schedules to be part of this important discussion and help us all to learn more about the implications of chronic absenteeism, the impact on our students and on our schools, and ideally what we can do about it to improve some of this opportunity to improve our students' attendance in schools. For some of you that are joining today that maybe haven't been too familiar with Helios Education Foundation, our opportunity to engage with us, and we hope today's webinar will help you to learn more about our organization and the work we do in the community, specifically working to support students being successful in post-secondary education in both Arizona and Florida. We like to think of Helios as an organization that's more than a grant-making organization. We focus on creating systemic change through public policy, research and evaluation, community investments, and grant-making, and also strategic communications. We like to bring data and facts and thought partnership to the community dialogue, and we do all of this in the spirit of partnership and collaboration with so many of you that we very much appreciate. As I said, our mission is all students to be successful in post-secondary education, but from a strategy perspective, because you can't support and engage with all students at one time, in Arizona, we prioritize how do we support traditionally underrepresented students, including Latino students and those from low-income backgrounds who face some of the greatest opportunity gaps in achieving education success. Helios is celebrating our 20th anniversary of being a foundation and doing this work with many of you. And we remain committed to creating opportunities for students to succeed and to create lasting improvements in education overall. Since our inception, we've invested, even though I said we're more than a grant maker, we have invested over $350 million in partnerships and initiatives that focus on improving third grade reading levels, increasing college going rates, and ultimately increasing our post-secondary attainment across Arizona and Florida. We've also positively impacted over 2.4 million students in this time, supported over 500,000 teachers, and we know how important the focusing on student learning and teaching are so important to education outcomes. But today's conversation is around chronic absenteeism. We recognize that chronically absent students has been a longstanding challenge for Arizona and all of our schools. And this was a challenge prior to the pandemic. But in 2022, Helios did some research to really better understand what was happening with chronic absenteeism. And what we really learned was that absenteeism was a challenge and a problem prior to the pandemic, but really elevated to a crisis with the implications and impact of the pandemic. And what we've seen is spiking levels of chronic absenteeism across the entire state. Today, we're following up on that research from 2022 to provide a follow-up report that shows the latest data around chronic absenteeism and talk about the continued effects that have on our students and our schools and our ability as a state to meet our education outcomes. It's sad to say that chronic absenteeism rates remain in Arizona more than twice as high as they were prior to the pandemic. And though there have been some improvements given the focus and attention that we've all tried to provide, there's still a lot of work to do. And I think that's what we're here to focus on today, is how do we continue to make chronic absenteeism a priority of addressing this challenge? And how do we do that together? How do we learn and understand some of the best practices that are in place? And we're going to have an opportunity to learn from some of our colleagues who will share some of that. But before we do that, we want to provide a little bit of this data, this follow-up data that we referenced. So at this time, I want to again thank you for joining us this morning, and I want to turn the program over to my colleague, Dr. Paul Perrault, who leads all of our research efforts here at Helios, to share a little bit more about this latest research and kind of put this discussion into context. So thank you again for joining us. Let me turn it over to Paul Perrault.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Steve. Good morning, everybody on the program today with me and the team. And I'm happy to be here with all of you talking about an issue that here in Arizona, but also nationally, has become a really important issue facing education and, where education is going to go in the future, chronic absenteeism. I'd like to really start out by identifying the partnerships that went into this work. Helios and WestEd researchers did a really great job of exploring the issue in the state, both in the original report and in this one. And I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the Arizona Department of Education when their partnership in assisting us with data and making it possible for us to look at this work. To begin with, I kind of really wanted to make sure that we're all talking about chronic absenteeism in the same way. So typically, chronic absenteeism is defined as missing 10% or more of the school year, which is typically 18 days, since a school year is around 180 school days. I also want to focus on the data. So the data that we will be talking about today centers mostly on the 22-23 academic year. And why are we focusing on this year? We're focusing on this year because it allows us to connect the data with outcomes such as math and English to get a better understanding of what was happening that year with chronic absenteeism, but then how it actually played out with student outcomes. I'm going to share my screen now so that we can, look into the data a little bit deeper. So when we think about chronic absenteeism and it being high nationwide, one of the things to really think about is chronic absenteeism rates nearly doubled in the 21-22 school year, that, like Paul talked about, increasing from 16% pre-pandemic to almost 30%. Now, there has been slow improvement in 22-23 school year. 44 states released chronic absenteeism data nationally, with 33 showing improvements of only 5 percentage points or less. At that time, Arizona had the 15th highest chronic absenteeism rate in the country. Now, you might ask, why is this important? It's important because nearly 1 of 3 Arizona students, basically 29% in grades 1 through 8, were chronically absent in the 22-23 school year. And we're focusing on 1 through 8 really right now because we wanted to see how this continued on through the elementary and middle schools. We'll be releasing a follow-up report on high school in the spring of this year. So while this represents a slight decline from the peak of 34% during 21-22, it remains more than pre-pandemic rates. So, if you think about that, even if it was, 10% or 16% where that number falls, staying at about double just really is completely high when we think about where the pandemic fell and how many years we have kind of moved past that pandemic. So some may ask, does it really matter? Kids missing school, they can find things online. They can, there's new ways to get lessons or miss things. Well, quite frankly, the answer is yes, it does matter. When large numbers of students regularly miss school, it makes it much harder for teachers to provide the consistent instruction that enables students to thrive. So think about teachers having students in and out all of the time, having to give up makeup assignments, having them not be on the same page of where a lesson is and that really creates problems in that classroom. When we start thinking about what are those long-term impacts, missing too much school is associated with poor learning outcomes. And honestly, this is quite timely as the NAEP results were released yesterday. And we saw a 6-point drop, for example, in reading for Arizona students. And so when we think about that, missing school, it's hard to do well if you're not in school. When we start seeing what we start seeing is once you're absent in school, you start being absent in other grades. And it really kind of starts from those elementary grades and continues on until you get to high school. What happens then? Well, we see an increase in disengagement if you don't do well in a subject, for example, math or English or any of those courses. Ultimately, it leads many students to either 1, drop out and just not finish school, or 2, it makes a lot less students ready for the workforce or college when they graduate. And that's why we really are thinking about this all the time at Helios too, as we think about preparing students for college and career. What happens if we have kids that are just not in school and not doing well? So want to give us, so for the panel and for the audience to really kind of have some facts and numbers to talk about as we go into this, I'm going to highlight some key points as we go in this. So overall, rates went down, but again, remain 2 times higher than the pandemic. And what I'm showing you here is a dash line and a solid line. The solid line is the current definition of school, of chronic absenteeism, meaning you miss 18 or more days in the same school. Now, we've actually looked at this data as for students that have missed 18 or more days, regardless of the school they're in. And that's what that differential line is. And it's about a 1 to 2% difference. And if you think about 1 million kids that are in the Arizona school system, that 1 or 2% can mean a lot more kids that are actually chronically absent. One of the groups that really kind of has been hit with the chronic absenteeism, and they were a group that missed a lot before the pandemic, are mobile students. So mobile students are those students that are typically, going from multiple schools per school year, so more than one. And so when we look at our alternate definitions, which, the alternate definition here would be that dotted line again, showing students that are missing 18 or more days across multiple schools, you can see that it really increases for those students. So those students are one of the groups that continue to be hit hard by missing a lot of school, and that has carried forward and started before the pandemic and has carried forward after the pandemic. We also really want to understand how chronic absenteeism has impacted groups of students. And one of the most important ones that we really look at is those students that are economically disadvantaged. And one of the ways that we do this is we collect data on students' free and reduced lunch eligibility. That really is the only proxy that we have that can tell if a student is low income or economically disadvantaged in the K through 12 setting. And so what you see here in this graphic is on the left-hand side are students that were not economically disadvantaged and those students that were economically disadvantaged. There's 3 different colored bars. The dark blue bar is the post-pandemic cohort. The light blue is the pandemic cohort, and the orange is the pre-pandemic. And for the next few charts, it'll have this similar kind of array of 3 different cohorts, one pre, one at the pandemic, one post. And then for all of them, we're also looking at how does this play out over 2 years from grade 5 to 7th? Did we see increases? And grade 5 and 7 are a good comparison because there's a strong correlation of how we can look at that data over time and chronic absenteeism rate. Well, one of the things we can see if we just look at the orange is, you started with lower chronic absenteeism rates in the pre-pandemic. All of those groups over time really, went up over the pandemic, and then continue to stay high post-pandemic. But if you look at the right-hand side, those students that are economically disadvantaged are still missing school at a much higher rate, or are chronically absent at a much higher rate than those students that are not on free and reduced lunch. And that's important because, oftentimes we see those students have the biggest gaps in learning outcomes, such as math and English and science and in other categories too. And so when we're trying to make sure that we close those gaps and give those students opportunities, it's important to understand that our kids that might need the most help right here are continuing to miss school, and they're missing school at higher rates. We can also break this along racial and ethnic lines too. And so this same graph does the same thing with the pre-pandemic, post-pandemic, and during the pandemic too. And we break this down by race and ethnicity. And one of the things that we've talked about in the last time we had this discussion and continues here now is that, for American Indians or Native Americans in the state of Arizona, chronic absenteeism was a problem before the pandemic and still continues to be a problem too. Interestingly enough, if we do look at a comparison of Black students, Hispanic students, and white students, before the pandemic, those categories were all those groupings almost missed school at about the same rate. But for some reason, we've seen over time that Hispanic students and Black students have continued at a higher rate of missing school than they did before the pandemic. We're trying to figure out why is the case there? How can we reach out and talk with community partners? Because again, we want to make sure that every student has that opportunity to do well in school. And so thinking about this from this opportunity lens, we want to make sure that all kids are missing the least amount of days that they can when we go to school. We've also looked at the category of gap between ELL and non-ELL students. And again, the non-English language learners on the left, English language learners on the right. Here we actually see a glimmer of a good glimmer of hope. English language learners now in the last couple of years have really started to reduce the number of chronic absences. And that we really feel is important as we get to those learning outcomes of ELA and reading and other opportunities. Still seeing those students that are English language learners miss at a higher rate than their non-English language learners, but that rate is starting to come down, and we want to see that trend happening and continuing, so that students can do really well. Now, we've looked at that last time, and when we actually looked at chronic absenteeism, and where we really start looking at some new things is what does it mean for learning outcomes? And so here we're looking at English language arts in grade five. Again, on the left-hand side are going to be ELA students that are proficient in grade 5, not ELA proficient in grade 5 is going to be on the right. And back to some of those earlier findings we talked about. What happens when students are not doing well in school? They end up missing more school. Here we can kind of see that trend playing out in this data. Those students that are not ELA proficient in grade 5 have much higher rates of chronic absenteeism. And we're talking about grade 5. So if they're not doing well in grade 5, we really start to worry if they're not doing well in grade 6, 7, and beyond, because now that means they start disengaging in school. But here the data clearly shows, especially if we look at that left-hand side, chronic absenteeism rates are much lower for those students that are proficient in reading. And that's why we really, stress this. How can we make sure that we're thinking about what's happening with those students and what's happening with their learning outcomes? We kind of tie that same exact story with math. And again, quickly to go over the graphics, same kind of things. Left-hand side is math proficiency. Right-hand side is not math proficiency. And our data clearly shows us that those students that are not proficient in mathematics are missing more school. And that really kind of is that big cornerstone that we're worried about. If we really want to improve those math and reading NAEP scores that we just saw and other things that we're looking at, we really need to make sure that kids are in school. And while we're starting to see some of these rates go down, they're not going down fast enough. We're still much higher than we were before the pandemic. And that obviously is creating a lot of challenges. So, while chronic absenteeism remains a major challenge, we are seeing more glimmers of hope. I don't want to just show all of this and say, we're in a world of hurt. We are seeing some really positive things. First, we are seeing absences go down, but like I said, the rate of change is slow, and that leaves a lot of kids behind. We can't afford to leave any more kids behind. We really need to make sure that we step up these opportunities to get kids back in school. Second, we are seeing schools and districts implement successful policies. For example, using more data more effectively, building relationships with families and parents, that really is having positive outcomes. Third, we are seeing more communities and districts tackle this problem, giving us hope that through those partnerships that we'll be able to solve this. And fourth, through the creation of the Arizona Chronic Absenteeism Task Force, really, through our read-on partners, we're seeing more and more people come together to solve this problem. And if anyone is interested, there's a lot more details and opportunities to dig deeper into the data that we show. We put up this QR code so you can download the report. But just wanted to highlight those key challenges as we dig into this more deeply. Steve, with that, why don't I turn this back over to you?
Well, thanks so much for that presentation. And now it's time to introduce our panelists to discuss some of the numbers and more broadly chronic absenteeism and some of the information Dr. Peralt provided. Paul J. Luna, President and CEO of the Helios Education Foundation, State Representative Matt Gress, Chair of the House Education Committee, Lori Masur, Director of Early Learning for Read On Arizona, and Erica Mancia, Principal at William R. Sullivan Elementary School. Good morning to all of you. Thanks very much for being here. And I also want to remind those folks who are watching live, please feel free to send in questions. We will get to them if possible as we have time throughout the rest of this hour. I have specific questions I want to ask for each of you, but to get us all warmed up in the conversation, Paul Luna, I'll start with you. It seems like an obvious question, I suppose, but why does being in class matter so much? Dr. Peralt had the numbers, had the figures, but from a standpoint of those of us who've all been through school, we're associated with schools, or we have kids or nieces or nephews. First of all, you, Paul Luna, why is it so important to get kids to go to school as often as possible?
So, well, I'll start with sort of a simple response, and it's kind of piggybacking off of the lottery that says you can't win if you don't play, right? And so there's a similar element to that, and I'm not trying to be facetious. I'm just trying to make a connection that says, we are very focused in helping to ensure that all of our students in our education system have all of the opportunities to succeed academically, to pursue their educational dreams, for many students who might be that first generation college graduate in their family. And we know through research the impact of what post-secondary success has on that student, the family, our state, our economy. A more educated workforce will drive economic development for the state of Arizona. So knowing how important that is, that our students succeed in our education system, when you start to think about, okay, well, what are one of the major barriers for that success? It's when the student is not fully engaged. And we know there are many factors. I know we're going to be able to talk about more about what are the barriers and factors that are impacting chronic absenteeism. But it comes down to this point of, that correlation or that connection between chronic absenteeism and academic proficiency is really at the heart of why this matters. When students start to fall behind for whatever reason and they start to miss school, they're more likely to continue to fall behind. So this is why this becomes really important to us as those of us, all of us who care about our students succeeding. We have to ensure that our students and our families have the ability to get the students into the classroom, engaging with the teachers and learning. And I think that's why this matters so much.
And Lori, Paul sort of summed it up, but I just, each of you have different perspectives on things. So maybe piggybacking on what Paul said, what else comes to mind for you? I mean, I suppose, again, it's an obvious question, but why is it so important to get kids to at least be in school first, and then obviously the bigger picture goes out from there?
Absolutely. I think it's a great question. And I always like to put my teacher hat on after spending close to a decade in the classroom is that, learning follows a sequence and a progression. And if children aren't present on a consistent basis, they are missing that key critical instruction that is taking place within the classroom, in particular in the early years. We know from the perspective of a child learning to read that the most critical instructional years are kindergarten and first grade, which also happen to be the 2 years that we see probably the biggest spike in terms of the highest levels of chronic absence. We usually see this inverted bell curve, which goes back to the original work that Helios did for missing too much school, where we see, children come in at kindergarten, their rate is very high, then it starts to do this inverted bell curve and go down right around third grade and come back up. And at the end of the day, children are missing that critical instruction. So that they have that opportunity to be learning on grade level with their students. It's also important to note that from the perspective of a teacher, for every day that a student is absent, it takes a teacher approximately 2 days to get them caught back up. And when you consistently have 20 to 30% of your students who are absent, then from the perspective of the teacher, almost every day of the week, you are spending time not only teaching your lesson plan, but also doing your due diligence to bring children up to speed who have been absent.
Representative Grass, as chair of the House Education Committee, obviously it's a very important issue to you. At this basic level, why is it so important to just make sure kids are in school?
Well, for a variety of reasons. Certainly, being present and being in attendance, you're going to be able to learn. You'll have access to instruction and the lesson plans. But it also is important to build social skills. It's also important as it relates to our school lunch program for nutrition for many of our students who rely on schools as an important safety net. It's important for teachers to be able to have eyes on kids, especially when you consider that 70% of all of the mandatory reporting that goes to the Department of Child Safety are from teachers and other educators. So there's a panoply of many reasons. It's also a workforce issue. Many working Arizona families can't afford childcare, and while the purpose of school is not to be a daycare, it's a place for learning. It's also it should be a safe place for kids to be while their parents are working. So there are a variety of things, and you saw what happened when we closed schools down. Everything around us started to fall apart, and then you saw these absenteeism rates, as Dr. Peralt noted in his research, that skyrocketed after or during the pandemic. I remember being the budget director for the state of Arizona, and the Department of Education was coming back and telling us that we were going to have surpluses in our education line because kids weren't showing up. 40,000 kids disappeared when you looked at the 100th day average daily membership, which is the point in time that we calculate how much we pay schools. So it was a significant shift in terms of attendance. And, it looks like we're making some progress, but there's a lot of more work that we need to do in this area.
Erica, you have this experience on a daily basis, seeing your students, working with your students. What difference does it make to have the kids in school day after day?
Like it was already said, Steve, students being in school impacts students' ability to learn, because every single day of missed school can take multiple days for a student to catch up. And they're not only learning academics, they are also learning responsibilities and daily routines. That those responsibilities and daily routines, as they continue to practice these and reinforce them into their daily lives, it prepares them for real life. And I think that when they are here in school, they are learning about the social aspects, they are learning academics, they are learning other life skills that as they continue throughout life and throughout the grade levels, those build upon the other. And that just makes them understand how real life eventually will work out. So when a student is not here, like Lori mentioned, it's the gap is just getting bigger and bigger. And it just they start to lose that motivation, because now they know that they're behind their peers. They're not at the same level as their peers. And that's where that lack of motivation starts to develop. And bringing that motivation up is a lot of hard work, especially if that student or the student, it doesn't have it. So we have to bring it back to them. And that's where we have to start to get a creative, so that they know that they have that willingness within them. It's just knowing how to bring it out.
Thank you. And as I said, I want to get as many specific questions to each of you as I can, and we're going to move forward, but I also want to ask one question a little bit goes in the past, specifically to Paul and Lori on this. Paul, let me start with you on it. I think a lot of people started paying attention to chronic absenteeism because of the pandemic, as all of you've talked about. But at what point, Paul, was this an important issue for you, for Helios? Is this something that has been in the education community, is something that has been talked about a lot and just started to get more headlines because of the pandemic?
I think it's a little bit of what you just said, right? I think there was an acknowledgement of absenteeism in schools and just the basic understanding of students missing school, they fall behind. And as Erica just shared, what starts to happen to that student is they start to disengage more. What really, I think, crystallized this conversation even more, which I think helps all of us to better understand, is when you start looking at the data. When you start to understand what percentage of students in our education system are missing school, are chronically absent, 18 school days or more, and you start to think about the numbers of students that actually represents, then it starts to you start to feel a greater understanding of why this is important. We're not just talking about a handful of students. We're talking about a significant number of students that are chronically absent in our system. And I think what it's helped to do is by bringing the data and the information and comparing different cohorts and recognizing a couple elements that come out of the data. And that is, for example, chronic absenteeism affects all types of students from all backgrounds. And that's important to understand. But when you dig into the data, you start to see some elements where there might be greater impacts on certain types of student populations. Paul spoke about students defined as mobile students, right? So, which maybe indicates that there are housing challenges or changes within that student or family environment. Students who are on free and reduced lunch having higher percentage of chronic absenteeism. We, for example, in Arizona, we know that 10% of our student population are students who are Arizona residents, Arizona citizens, who might be in their family unit and family environment, part of what we'd call mixed documentation family status, where somebody in their family might be undocumented. And when you start to think, for example, on some of the immigration policy changes that are happening, you start to get concerned about, well, what's the implication on that student population? I said that, again, it's upwards of 10% of these students who might now feel uncomfortable with changing immigration enforcement. And are we going to start to have student populations missing and increasing chronic absenteeism in that student population? So the data, the information, I think, helps to raise the awareness. And I think what's really positive about that is then we can get to solutions. With better understanding, we get to how do we engage the communities, the families, the students to improve and get students into the classroom.
A lot of important things to mention there, Paul. With the limited time, though, I want to make sure we get Lori into. Laura, how much of what Paul said is what prompted Read on Arizona to convene the Arizona Chronic Absence Task Force?
Quite a bit, actually. The original Missing Too Much School report, along with the data released from the Department of Education, was actually the impetus to the creation of the Arizona Chronic Absence Task Force. Read on Arizona had been exploring and working quite closely with the Arizona Department of Education for close to a decade on the correlation between chronic absence and literacy proficiency rates. Actually, there was a study done prior to the pandemic that showed that for every 1% that a school improved attendance, there was a 1.5% increase in the number of students who were passing the statewide ELA assessment. So when we saw the original Missing Too Much School report, along with realizing that in 2022 that chronic absence rates doubled, that really was the impetus. It was really that there was a fervent need to take that data and act upon that data so that we could bring school districts together, state representatives together, individuals from West Ed and Helios together to say, there's a problem and we know there are evidence-based solutions. How do we get these evidence-based solutions into the hands of community partners, of educators, of district leaders?
We'll get into some of those broader possibilities, including at the legislature. But Representative Grass, before we go to you, Eric, I wanted to ask about some of the things. I understand you're having some success making some strides in the Murphy Elementary School District in improving on this. Can you take us back to what it was like at its worst and how you've helped make some strides, and frankly, whether the strategies that you've implemented could work for any district throughout the state?
So the Murphy School District always puts students at a top priority, Steve. And post-pandemic, what we saw that parents were concerned of the well-being of their students and their safety here at school. They were afraid of sending the students to school, and the students were afraid to come to school. So as the school district, we worked really, really hard to reestablish that trust. And once the trust in our community, once we had gained that trust from the community, that's when parents started speaking up. They started asking for help. They would call me and they would say, Ms. Mancia, I have my student who does not want to go to school. I already explained to him that he or she is going to be safe at school, but I really don't know how to get him to school because I leave before he or she catches the bus. So I talked to the parents and I said, I am going to make myself available and I am going to go pick up your kid. You let me know if that is something that I need to do, and I am more willing to do that. Because like I said, not only for the Murphy School District, but for myself, education is of top priority. And I preach that to my students every single day. So the parent called, and not just one parent. I had a few parents calling me, and I would, at a good time, I would ask my SRO, let's go and pick up the student. Let's go get them. And I would wait for him or her outside of the door. Usually grandma was there waiting, and I would have the parent on the phone letting them know that we were there because we took our SRO and we didn't want them to, feel afraid. So we did that a couple of times, and then back to teaching them the responsibilities that they have to learn how to build I would bring them into the office and I would talk to them and say, it's time for you to start getting ready, and, you have to get on the bus on your own. And it's building that responsibility, building those routines, set your alarm, and tomorrow I'm expecting you to get on the bus. And after a few tries, the students were back in school because they knew that they had someone that they cared for them. They knew that we wanted them here at school, and they knew that it was just a matter of them coming and becoming comfortable in the school environment.
That's an amazing story, but I do have to ask, is that something that teachers, that principals, is that the sort of responsibility that they should have to have in order to get students in school? Obviously, what you did is fantastic, and that would be wonderful if all districts did that. But is that asking too much, frankly, of districts and individual teachers and principals?
I feel like if we want our students to be at school, it's just making a plan as to, it might be asking a little bit too much, but if that's the way that we're going to get our students to be in school, and it's just working around how many times we have to go pick them up, I think that it would not be an option. I think that they would be at school, and I think that all principals, teachers, if we all work as a team, I think that that's very much possible.
Senator Chris, we know there are obviously built-in challenges when it comes to making progress on policy or laws and bills. But can I ask you what your thoughts are as far as where chronic absenteeism, is it one of those that gets caught underneath some of the other headlines as far as education and education funding? How can you, as the chair of the House Education Committee, you and your colleagues, how can you make this an even higher priority and help some of these districts get along? It's not just about money, it's about care and thoughtfulness and all these sorts of things, and dedication from folks like Erica.
Well, certainly. And I mean, Erica's efforts are worthwhile in noting. I don't know how sustainable those would be for all of your kids, but I think it highlights a larger cultural shift that we have to bring people back to understanding that going to school is a must. And why I say that is we closed the schools. We were all part of this effort during the COVID-19 pandemic, even though we knew early on in the pandemic that kids were the least susceptible to contracting COVID or having negative outcomes. But we closed the schools, and I think that sent a message in some parts that being at school was secondary. It wasn't as important. When in hindsight, it was the most important thing we could have done for our kids. So I do believe that parents have a responsibility here, that they need to get their kids to school. But perhaps, the mid 2000s, it was all about let's lock the parents up. That obviously was a bad idea from the start. It didn't work. It's counterproductive, quite frankly, for trying to achieve our goal of improving attendance. But I think of like the Camelback High School. They're doing a very innovative program, 4 years running. In ninth grade, they have ninth grade teams of teachers that meet weekly and evaluate behavior, academics, and attendance of all of their kids. And they are triaging who's having problems, and then figuring out a plan to engage the parents, family members, the student, so that they're not falling through the cracks. And it's that proactive engagement in real time that I think is going to make a difference. The data that has been presented today should be a clarion call for us to engage in that work even more so. But in anticipation for this panel, I reached out to some school board members about attendance, and it's shockingly very little discussion on the school board level about attendance. These school boards need to be having regular conversations at least once a month, certainly once a quarter, about how attendance is going and what the administration of each school district is doing to prioritize getting kids into the classroom learning every day.
Paul, can you follow up on what Representative Gress had to say there? I saw you nodding a little bit.
Yeah, I was nodding in acknowledgement of recognizing that there are multiple facets here that are become the barriers that are impacting chronic absenteeism. And if I could just to acknowledge, the work of the teachers and the school leadership, what we have found in our work, when you see the work of Read On and organizations like Valley Sun United Way and engaging with the schools and the communities to understand what are really the factors for each community. We often recognize that education is a very local type of activity, right? It's local communities, schools, neighborhoods, and such. And getting our school leadership, who I know are committed this, to understand what the real factors and barriers are that are impacting the students' ability to get to school. There's no one silver bullet that addresses this across the state. So that's what the importance of the community coming together. Our representative talking about from a policy perspective, from a board member perspective, making sure that chronic absenteeism is something that we're monitoring and aware of, but understanding the real community factors and dynamics that might be impacting that. And then how do we go about as a community providing those solutions? And I think just acknowledging the importance of that, leaning into this idea that we can do a better job of helping students and parents to understand why school is important, why academic success is important, why that's going to lead to greater success for them and our communities through education success, making sure that the school and the learning is relevant to what the students want to see. I saw in some of the comments, there's acknowledgement of some of the extracurricular activities at schools is very much an attraction for a student to want to come to school. So how do we make sure those opportunities are there for the students as well? I know for me personally, my life was very clear with my parents. I liked playing sports, and my parents basically said, well, then you got to go to school and get good grades, or else you can't play any of the other sports you want to play. I showed up at school every day because I wanted to go to practice after school. It's getting into that type of engagement and understanding and meeting the students and families where they need our help and support.
Lori, I'd love to hear from you on that one.
I think, Paul hit the nail right on the head. I think what we have to remember with chronic absence and the reasons that students are absent is that is very complex and varied, dependent on the family and dependent on where you're at. The reasons a student might be absent for Erica and Murphy are going to look different than if I, go north of the 40 and I head into, Tuba City or Window Rock, or I go into Tucson. The important thing that I think that this data highlights or school data highlights is that there's an opportunity to dig deeper into that data and to take action onto that data to begin to identify what groups or subgroups of students are absent, and then to dig deeper and to find out what's the root cause? Why are their students absent? And then begin to talk about the intervention that can be deployed to address that. I think the other underlying piece is, how do we help support schools and districts with strategies that are proactive? How are we creating a culture of belonging at a school? Erica, I think, just has such a great example at Murphy of how they're building those relationships and creating a culture of belonging that students want to show up to, and then to acknowledge the comments that are coming through extracurricular activities, partnerships with local healthcare. How many times are students missing school because the dentist appointment isn't available for, after school times, or they can only get into the pediatrician's office, during school time. It's such a multifaceted and complex problem. And that's where we talk about, to Paul's point, that there's no silver bullet, but it's also not the sole responsibility of the school. It's about, how are we engaging community partners? How are we engaging out of school time programs? How are we engaging, the healthcare field to all come together collectively to talk about and address attendance?
Eric, I want to ask you about engaging with parents when you talked about you and the SRO and calling the different homes and whatnot. I presume different parents in different districts are going to have different responses to that kind of thing. How do you approach it in a way that makes it clear to parents that this is about their children, their children's future, and there isn't any judgment attached to it, I suppose? Because people can get defensive about things that are you telling me that I don't know how to get my kid to school? Or you're telling me, and not taking into account other things. I hope that's an appropriate question because it does strike me that we are still human to human on this. So how do you get the priority across without maybe offending someone's personal freedoms or something like that?
I do that, Steve, by first creating that relationship of trust with the parents. You can't just come out to a parent and tell the parent, why are you not bringing your student to school? They need to be sitting here every single day. It takes time. And with time, you start to build that trust and that relationship with the parents. You greet them out in the front. You give them a phone call. You send the class dojos. Now that with class dojo, it's very easy to have communication. And once you have built that relationship and you know that that's a very solid relationship, then you start talking to the parent and you start letting the parent know. And it takes time. And you start letting that parent know, is there an issue? Is there any problems? How can I help? Always making sure that you approach it in that way, that you want to help the student and you want to help the family if there's any need that that is preventing the student from showing up every single day at school. How can we help you? And I think that's the best approach that I have found that has worked here at William R. Sullivan, because then parents start to open up and they start to tell us, their personal issues that they're going through. And that's where we start to find the loops as to how we could better support them and assist them so that we could know that the students are here.
Paul, how does that sound to you? Is that sustainable? Is that workable in other districts and across the state?
Well, I think that's the model for engagement, right? Is describing and understanding, and I think we're hearing a central theme that it's not the responsibility of any one of us as individuals or organizations, and I think that's, if anything, the takeaway today is this idea of bringing data and fact and understanding to the discussion, understanding the impact of chronic absenteeism on our students, on our education system, and ultimately on our economy in the future, and recognizing what an important situation this is for us to address, and all of us coming together. And that's why I think it's gratifying to see legislative leadership, to see education leaders, to see community-based organizations fully engaged, getting parents. We've heard a lot about parental engagement, understanding where the families are at, recognizing what's happening uniquely to each type of family or target population of students, and working together to provide solutions, and being focused on the ultimate goal is getting our students in the classroom, learning and being successful on their education journey.
I want to turn to one of our viewer questions now. Longer term, this is from Scott. We have also reduced many students' motivation and their perceived relevance of school by narrowing the focus so much to reading and math and slashing physical and health education, arts, school counselors. How can we restore more whole child education in our school days? Representative Gress, I don't know if that's fair to go to you on that one, but since there is policy sort of question attached to that, do you think that's important? Talk about people not getting enough civics education, but has there been too much emphasis, in your opinion, on reading and math? And has that affected whether families are more inclined to send their kids to a school?
Well, the most fundamental responsibility schools have is to teach kids how to read and write. That's at the very basic minimum. If you are not literate, it impacts your entire life. So we can't just throw academics out the window. In fact, I would argue that we have been focusing too little on academics because we've been distracted by what I perceive that are, other curricula and that focus on mental health and there's social emotional learning. I think that really has perhaps exacerbated the anxiety that kids are feeling at schools and taking away precious time for the basics of reading and math. Now, I suspect some people, perhaps on the panel or on who are listening, vehemently disagree, but I think that's a large sentiment. As it relates to reading and math in general, especially in the upper grades, I think there has to be a more serious conversation about what does college, career, and military readiness look like. I remember teaching 10th and 11th grade English, and one of my students, we were going over Lord of the Flies. And he said, Mr. Gress, I don't really care about this book. I don't care what a metaphor is or simile or symbolism. I don't, I just want to go and get the training to go be a welder. I want to go and be a welder, you know, in Tulsa. And I mean, I'm trying to prepare him as though he's going to college, and we have this one size fits all regime. It's not relevant to him. And so if all we're doing is putting him into this box of college readiness, and he doesn't want to go to college, he wants to get a career in technical skills, that's going to be less of a motivation for him to show up. Now it's a little different in the younger grades because those preferences really haven't been explored as much. But in the upper grades, I think that has to be a renewed conversation about what we expect at the end of their time in the K-12 system. And we should make some adjustments. Education needs to be relevant to these students, or else they're not going to show up.
Erica, let me go to you on this. We have a question from Jeff regarding the fear factor of students. Perhaps we talked about being afraid to come to school. Wouldn't we agree that a big fear factor is that of bullying, intimidation, threats, and other person-to-person conflict? So that's Jeff's question. And if that is the case, is that something that does cause chronic absenteeism, where kids are afraid, not necessarily of, you mentioned possible immigration status, which is an issue for another day, but in terms of actually being afraid of fellow students or feeling like, oh, if I go, I'm going to be bullied. And that's and parents must be concerned about that as well. How can my child focus on education if they're being bullied all the time? I just wanted to get your take on that.
You know, bullying has been an issue, and I think that the most important thing is learning how to address it. And again, I go back to building those relationships with the parents. If you don't build the relationship with the parents, if you don't build the relationship with the students, they're never going to be able to come to you and talk to you about what's going on. I think it's important that a student within a school has an adult that they feel comfortable going to and talking to and sharing those concerns. And I think that's where it's the importance of building that tight niche community within the school system, within your school. And I think that I have an amazing staff that is very supportive. And if they hear if they hear a student going over to them, talking to them about, you know, someone bullying them, they immediately come to me and they share that. And then I address it with the student. And sometimes, you know, they want to keep it confidential because they don't want to lose that relationship that they have established with the student. So then what happens is that I find my way around. And I think as school principals, we just have to learn how to find our way around to talking to that student without, you know, throwing that adult under the bus saying, well, you know, so-and-so was the one who came and told me. We just have to be very, very strategic as to how we approach the situation. And I think we cannot minimize any of the reports that we receive. Every report we should take it and take it very, you know, to take it full course. Ask the student how he or she feels, investigate and ensure that the situation has been resolved, and go back and talk to that adult, to that teacher that the student confide in, and see if that student has come back to them to share if there are any other issues. And I think that's the best way to address those fears. Because I think when a student does not feel like their voice is being heard, then yes, that is going to be a motivation for them not to want to come to school.
We're just down to the last few minutes, and I have a couple of solution questions for all of you. But before we go to that, Lori, one more question for you. I'm going to direct this to you from Stephanie. So that's such a key component of the solution here. How does the state monitor and track parent engagement across schools? Is that something that factors in? Is that something there are a possibility to actually look into?
To my knowledge right now, there is not necessarily a reporting component relative to family engagement that gets reported up to the state that we're able to track. But to Stephanie and others' points, I think we know the impact and power of robust, family and student engagement. I will point everyone to an article from the Harvard Graduate School of Education that came out in March or May of last year, that talked about one of the #1 indicators of student attendance that actually outweighed poverty was a robust family engagement and student engagement. So going back to some of the earlier comments, how are we leveraging out of school time programs? Going back to, Erica's boots on the ground at Sullivan and really, demonstrating those strong relationships that are being established. And I think it reminds us all that, change moves at the pace of trust. And so students have to trust, teachers and school personnel. Families also have to trust them in order to disclose some of the underlying reasons and causes that are leading to their child not showing up to school, in order for schools to partner with those families in order to identify those solutions that they're going to deploy. So I think one of the key takeaways from all of this is that there are a multitude of reasons for why, students are missing school, and it's often complex. And so we have leadership at schools and community partners who are working diligently to work collectively and come together to think how we can address attendance.
Well, Lori, that leads us to sort of the final round. And I promise not a speed round, but because these are mega questions, but as brief an answer as you can give. And Paul, let me start with you. Given the unique role that you have in the education system at Helios, how do you see yourself, how do you see the organization contributing to reducing chronic absenteeism in Arizona schools?
So I think we would begin by acknowledging that chronic absenteeism requires a multifaceted strategic approach, and beginning with an acknowledgement, an understanding, and a focus on the crisis that exists. And that's where the data comes in. And I did see a question in the chat that asks, well, does the data dig into the why? Why are students being absent? This particular data does not. This is just sharing the percentage and the numbers of students that are absent. The idea, and I think our role and where we're committed to being engaged, is recognizing that this will take a community approach to understand why students are missing school, what the real barriers might be, and that could be different one community to another. How can we engage parents? How might we look at policy solutions? But it is a commitment of engaging comprehensively, supporting the organizations like Read On, supporting our teachers and our education leaders in the classroom, to make this a priority so that we can start to address getting students into the classrooms and learning. And so I think that's how we see ourselves engaging in this and continuing to share our research and our learning to build greater champions for addressing this challenge.
And Erica, to you, you've already shared some great stories about how you personally involved and your particular school has gotten involved. But going forward, is there something that you think that based on the contributions you've made and what you've shared today, then that can be a bigger part of helping mitigate the problem or lessen the problem to some extent of chronic absenteeism?
I think it's just setting goals. Here at the Murphy School District, we set goals, and every year it's trying to address the problem before the problem gets any bigger. And as we move forward every year, we are setting a goal, a 5% goal, where we will reach this goal by continuing to build the trust that we have with our parents, building good relationships with parents and students, and educating parents. I think that's the important piece also, to educate parents on how chronic absenteeism can affect their child's future. And celebrating the wins. There could be small wins, but we also have to celebrate the wins. I think that it is also very important when I am out there every morning and I have 559 students on campus. And when you greet them every single day by their name, and you tell them that you're happy to see them and that you're glad that they show up to school, and then at the end of the day, when they are walking out and you say goodbye to them and you tell them, I'm expecting you to see you here tomorrow, that sends a big message to the students, and that is reinforcing the idea that they belong in the community and that they have a community that supports them and that wants to see them succeed. And they tell me all the time, like, Ms. Mancia, how do you know everyone's name? And I just respond to them, because And it's not necessarily that others don't care. It's because I care for you and I want to get to know you better. And you could see just their eyes sparkle, like they feel just an extra special student.
Thank you. Representative Grass, I've only got a minute for you, and there are so many things to talk about with the legislature, but how much of a priority can chronic absenteeism be for you on the House Education Committee? Is this something, I hesitate to use the word bipartisan these days, hint of sarcasm there for you, but is there a feeling that this is something that people can come together on and really help limit the problem here in Arizona, and help get those numbers down?
Absolutely, Steve. We can all agree we want kids in school. We want kids to be learning. And I think it comes with setting that expectation. Students will rise to meet the expectation, whatever we set. If we set low expectations, they will meet them. If we set high expectations, they will meet them. It used to be, when I was growing up, there was only one reason why I wouldn't be at school: a fever. And I had a single mom who worked during the days in a factory 30 minutes away. We had to get up, we had to walk to school on our own. And if we didn't show up to school, the school was going to call my mom, and we were going to pay the price at home. So there was an expectation from my mom, there was an expectation from the school that you're going to show up. Even if you don't like what's going on at school, if you feel like you're bored or whatever, you're showing up. And I think the school also has a responsibility to make sure that what they're doing is relevant, that they're having a school culture that's welcoming, that you're not suffering from bullying, and that there's appropriate discipline across the school district so that everyone feels safe and welcome and ready to learn.
Or you get the last word for us. We've discussed some solutions, but give us, I know a minute isn't much, but give us a minute or so on what you think needs to be prioritized as we end this.
I think one of the things that we can prioritize is how we support schools in not only collecting attendance data, but really being data literate and knowing how to take action on that attendance data, and really using that data to really drive effective solutions and interventions and preventions that they can deploy at their school. I noticed that the Arizona Chronic Absence Resource Guide was put into the chat, and that really is designed for administrators as a roadmap from point A to point Z, how you can address chronic absence. It has a menu and an array of intervention strategies effectively known to reduce chronic absence. And so I would leave everyone with that: lean into your data, take action on your data, and allow it to help determine those strategies that you're going to implement in order to support families and students.
Excellent. That's a terrific reminder. So those of you who are watching us live, but you can also catch it later when it's posted online to YouTube. You can download the report. We also encourage you to read the Arizona Chronic Absence Task Force recommendations and research guide. And also, those of you who've been with us, there'll be an email with a blog recap of the webinar, and the video will be in their inbox in the coming days. So again, thank you all for joining us this morning. And I want to thank our panelists as well: Paul J. Luna, President and CEO of the Helios Education Foundation; State Representative Matt Gress, Chair of the House Education Committee; Lori Masur, Director of Early Learning for Read On Arizona; Erica Mancia, Principal at William R. Sullivan Elementary School; and earlier we heard from Dr. Paul Peralt. Thank you all so much for joining us. Thanks very much for the great contributions. I'm Steve Goldstein. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.